The official narrative described Operation Medusa as a victory, but declassified and eyewitness material, released over years and updated most recently, complicates that account. Evidence and veterans' testimonies indicate the White School was fortified as a focal point of resistance, and Taliban leaders used its position and terrain to create a kill zone that NATO nearly couldn't escape. This video explains how the White School became a trap, what operational and political decisions shaped NATO's limits, and the long-term consequences that altered modern doctrine. The question that remains is simple. How did an insurgency grow strong enough to challenge Kandahar itself? Afghanistan in 2006, the stage for Operation Medusa. Afghanistan in 2006 stood at a fragile crossroads. Kandahar, the symbolic heart of the Taliban movement, outwardly showed signs of recovery. Markets reopened, roads carried a cautious flow of traffic, and international troops patrolled the streets. Yet these glimpses of routine were deceptive. Beneath the appearance of stability, rural districts surrounding the city concealed layered insurgent networks that operated largely without interruption. NATO soldiers sensed fragments of normal life, but missed how firmly the Taliban were embedding themselves in the countryside. These outward signals of renewal masked the depth of the rural insurgency, already preparing for sustained confrontation. The deeper issue lay with the Afghan government's chronic weaknesses. Corruption ran through every tier of administration, hollowing out public trust. Funds earmarked for reconstruction projects often vanished into the hands of intermediaries before reaching communities. Police forces were undermanned and under-equipped, unable to deter insurgent influence. Tribal leaders voiced frustration that Kabul felt remote and ineffective, while many villagers tolerated or cooperated with the Taliban for survival because of weak governance, endemic corruption, and the absence of consistent security. In several rural districts, insurgent court systems, swift if harsh, offered more predictable judgment than the state. To outsiders, allegiance looked like rebellion, but on the ground, collaboration was often a calculation of survival. At the same time, recruitment into the Taliban grew steadily. Intelligence reports framed the group as a fragmented movement, but in reality, its strength was expanding. Families, mosques, and labor networks sent young men into the fight, while older veterans carried with them combat experience from Soviet and factional wars of previous decades. This mix of new energy and seasoned leadership gave the insurgency depth. NATO patrols faced ambushes of unexpected size and coordination, catching soldiers off guard because assumptions written in distant capitals did not match the conditions encountered in Panjwai's fields. By mid-2006, some Canadian intelligence officers and Afghan counterparts were already warning that fortified compounds in the district suggested the area was becoming a staging hub. They noted that large, defensible positions were being ready to resist conventional assaults, a warning that only grew more apparent when battle eventually came. Of all regions in southern Afghanistan, Panjwai held decisive weight. Positioned as the agricultural green belt of Kandahar, it linked rural strongholds to the city itself. Whoever commanded this ground effectively controlled the approaches to the provincial capital. Its villages and orchards created cover for insurgents, while convoys attempting to cross the area but lacking constant protection could be attacked before reaching the city. The canals and vineyards made maneuver difficult, creating natural choke points, while irrigation ditches became fighting positions dug in over generations of conflict. The terrain was a fortress in its own right. NATO struggled to exert permanent presence there, and fighters who called the district home knew how to use every culvert, every slope, and every mud brick compound to their advantage. This pattern was not new. Decades earlier, the British had been bloodied in similar ground, and the Soviets also suffered in Kandahar's surrounding farmland. The land consistently favored ambush, delay, and attrition. Walls doubled as ramparts, alleys trapped armored vehicles, ridgelines kept watch over valley approaches. For men raised among these defenses, the topography itself was a weapon. NATO patrols grimly joked that almost every home seemed prepared to host a firefight, a sentiment close to reality in districts where insurgents built positions into otherwise ordinary compounds. The historical memory of outsiders being worn down in these fields gave Taliban commanders both confidence and precedent. Canada's role by 2006 placed it at the center of these realities. Within NATO's regional command south, Canadian forces accepted leadership responsibilities, taking on some of the heaviest combat obligations. Policymakers in Ottawa saw this as a chance to demonstrate capability. For the soldiers on the ground, it meant carrying a disproportionate share of risk. When Operation Medusa moved from planning to execution, it was Canadian units selected to lead the initial assaults. Support came from allies in the form of artillery, air power, and logistics, but the spearhead was firmly Canadian. Commanders hoped a concentrated strike in Panjwai could blunt the Taliban's massing strength and prevent its further entrenchment. The operation was imagined as the hammer that would scatter fighters into smaller, less threatening bands. Yet not all voices were confident. Some planners in NATO discussions questioned whether the number of troops committed would be sufficient or whether resources were being stretched thin by simultaneous security demands elsewhere in the south. Although strategic optimism dominated, a shadow of doubt ran beneath the briefings. Meanwhile, the Taliban had prepared. Reinforcements slipped into the green belt undetected, trenches and firing points were stocked with ammunition, and civilians were pressured into tolerating or concealing these activities. Networks of lookouts coordinated signals, ensuring fighters could redistribute under fire. As NATO gathered strength for what it believed was an offensive push, insurgent leaders had already arranged their defense. The stage was not as balanced as planners assumed. The coalition prepared to advance, but the battlefield had been laid with obstacles designed to exact heavy losses. Kandahar's larger meaning only raised the stakes. It was not a matter of clearing villages alone. Holding Kandahar represented legitimacy. For the Taliban, resistance in their birthplace symbolized survival against global powers. For NATO, establishing stability, there was a message that insurgency could be crushed even in its heartland. Afghan communities, regional actors, and foreign governments all studied what happened in Kandahar as a barometer of strength. The battle's outcome would ripple into recruitment, funding, and public confidence across Afghanistan. Years later, released documents showed NATO intelligence had detected unusually strong concentrations of insurgents in Panjwai, even before Operation Medusa launched. Some commanders pressed ahead despite these reports, believing momentum demanded action. Others miscalculated the degree of preparation awaiting them. The mismatch between field observations and higher-level assumptions ensured that troops entered Panjwai amid uncertainty far starker than public accounts suggested at the time. This uncertainty set the conditions for what followed. Panjwai wasn't just contested farmland. It held key strongpoints where insurgents invested unusual effort in defense. And among them, one structure would soon stand out as the epicenter of violence and attrition, a building whose ordinary appearance concealed extraordinary risk. The decisions made around it would shape the most intense fighting NATO forces had faced in southern Afghanistan. The White School, from classroom to fortress. Why did a simple concrete schoolhouse in rural Kandahar become one of the most fiercely contested positions of the war? Known as the White School for its faded paint, it was built during earlier years of international aid and once echoed with lessons and children's voices. By 2006, though that purpose was gone, fighters had taken it over and reshaped it into a stronghold. Sitting at the convergence of fields and canal lines, the building stood as both a landmark and a choke point. Classrooms were gutted, furniture stripped out, and walls scarred with graffiti. Windows were blocked by sandbags, doors braced with heavy beams. The school had shifted from a site of learning into a military anchor point. Local stories captured the fear that surrounded the takeover. Some accounts say teachers were killed or intimidated when the Taliban claimed the building, punished for continuing classes under government instruction. In nearby villages, families understood the risk of resistance. Parents who once sent their children through its gates now kept their distance. The memory of a functioning school dissolved into something harsher, a place ordinary people avoided. knowing it was no longer theirs. What little community identity remained was stamped out by the sight of fighters sleeping where students once gathered. The Taliban did not choose the white school at random. Its location alone invited conflict. Set among orchards, narrow fields, and irrigation ditches, it overlooked the approaches with commanding sightlines. Any advance on the compound demanded that soldiers leave cover and move across open ground. The surrounding terrain created natural kill zones where attackers would be fully exposed before even reaching the perimeter. The structure's layout compounded these advantages. Thick concrete walls could withstand small arms fire, while firing slits and overlapping fields of machine gun coverage gave defenders multiple angles of control. Makeshift tunnels and dugouts around the property supported quick movement or counterattacks. For insurgent commanders, this was not just a defensive refuge. It was a ready-made fortress integrated into their wider network of positions around Panjwai. Coalition intelligence flagged the White School weeks before battle. Drone reconnaissance, listening posts, and Afghan partner reports described heavy presence inside. It was identified alongside trench systems and weapons dumps as a priority threat. Offensive planning included discussions of the risks posed by storming it directly. Yet this awareness sparked a dilemma that reached beyond military objectives. How to treat a building still publicly identified as a school, even if no students had walked its halls for years. The strategic debate soon reflected a clash between practical battlefield needs and political sensitivities. Some senior officers pressed for a decisive strike, arguing the compound was militarized beyond question. Destroying it from distance could prevent the inevitable loss of life that an assault would incur. Others warned that flattening a schoolhouse, even one repurposed for war, would hand propaganda to the Taliban and damage NATO's narrative about protecting Afghan communities. Kabul officials added their concerns, aware that images of leveled schools could resonate far beyond Panjwai. NATO's rules on targeting schools reinforced this restraint. Strikes against compounds labeled as education facilities demanded higher-level clearance and legal reviews, a safeguard meant to prevent civilian harm and limit propaganda fallout. Veterans later recalled how such restrictions slowed response times in the middle of firefights. In the case of the White School, this meant that artillery requests and airstrike approvals required multiple authorizations, leaving soldiers on the ground to fight without immediate heavy support. As orders filtered down, the decision became clear. The school would not be demolished outright. Political caution dictated that it be treated as one fortified position among many, to be cleared instead of leveled. For the troops tasked with the approach, this meant storming a fortified, occupied stronghold while holding back some of the most decisive tools at their disposal. The enemy inside would enjoy the luxury of hardened defenses while their attackers shouldered the greatest risk. This created a situation of deliberate imbalance. Everyone in the chain of command recognized that the building was occupied and prepared. Everyone briefed soldiers that it was a known hazard, yet the plan still placed NATO forces in the position of assaulting it across exposed ground. The buffer created by political constraints effectively gave the Taliban time, cover, and confidence. From behind their reinforced walls, insurgents could measure shots with little fear of overwhelming bombardment. When coalition patrols first moved within range, these preparations became obvious. Machine guns fired across open fields, rocket-propelled grenades targeted advance routes, and every attempt to cross irrigation lines was punished. Villagers nearby watched silently. Some passed word to the fighters, others simply stayed away to avoid retribution. For NATO troops, restraint in fire support translated directly into vulnerability. Every shell withheld became a tactical advantage for those inside the compound. The White School quickly emerged as a symbol of the wider contradictions of the war. Political sensitivity demanded proportionality, but on the ground, this meant young soldiers charged into defenses without the protective edge of their full arsenal. What was conceived as balance, avoiding civilian outrage while adapting to insurgent tactics, instead revealed how decisiveness could be eroded by caution. For the Taliban, the transformation of a school into a fortress was more than tactical. It inverted the coalition's strengths, forcing NATO to fight with one hand tied behind its back. In tactical debriefs after the fact, officers noted how the building taught hard lessons in adaptation. Insurgent planners had used NATO's own playbook against them, embedding defenses in civilian-linked infrastructure, anticipating the political hesitance to destroy it, and turning that delay into space for ambush. The stronger the coalition's concern for perception, the more time the defenders had to entrench. The contested White School stood as proof that the battlefield in Afghanistan was never just about terrain. It was about symbols, narratives, and political risk. Abandoning its original function, it embodied the collision between local communities caught in fear and global powers caught in restraint. For soldiers preparing to move toward it, the awareness of what it represented was as sharp as the gunfire it concealed. As NATO units assembled and began their cautious movement across the layered farmland, the echoes of those decisions pressed in on every step. The open ground between canal lines offered no shelter, and the tension of the approach was heavy with the expectation of sudden violence. Ambush and chaos, the White School kill zone. The opening clash around the White School turned a planned advance into an immediate fight for survival. What began as calculated movement through farmland shifted in an instant when fire erupted from prepared positions. Canadian troops clearing the last slivers of cover were met with explosions from rocket-propelled grenades, followed by the relentless stutter of machine guns. The ground shook with impact as rounds and shrapnel cut across the fields. Within seconds, open ground that should have been a line of approach became an engineered kill zone. Soldiers tried desperately to drop into grape rows or irrigation trenches, but there was little real safety. Weapons inside the White School compound were firing in coordination with teams dug into positions further out. This was not sporadic resistance. It was organized and relentless, designed to pin attackers wherever they moved. The chaos spread quickly. Some Afghan police units, placed on the flanks to support the Canadians, retreated under the weight of fire. Their sudden absence opened gaps and left parts of the advance dangerously exposed. NATO soldiers saw their numbers thinning in real time, with the retreat not only reducing firepower, but eroding morale. In those opening minutes, the field became less a front line and more a patchwork of scattered pockets under relentless pressure. Pinned down, the Canadians held on against superior numbers. Taliban formations, later estimated at several hundred fighters, staged their resistance with precision. RPGs targeted vehicles, pushing crews to cover, while rifle fire raked every embankment where soldiers huddled. Maneuver was nearly impossible. Veterans later described how insurgents rotated men through firing positions, ensuring a steady pressure that fatigued the attackers but seldom the defenders. It was a system NATO could not mirror in that moment. There were no reinforcements cycling in and out, only the same soldiers holding fast under hours of fire. Commanders' instinct was to call for overwhelming fire support. Airstrikes and artillery could neutralize entrenched gun crews, yet those calls for strikes were returned with hesitation or denial. Some clearances required higher authorization, others were blocked due to the potential risk to surrounding settlements. On the ground, this felt like paralysis. Men pinned under fire could not reconcile the scale of danger with the cautious tone of distant headquarters. Frustration mounted as urgent requests went unresolved, and disbelief grew as commanders realized heavy weapons were being withheld while casualties rose. To keep forward positions alive, reinforcements were ordered into the same exposed ground. Officers recorded the grim knowledge of what those decisions meant, sending squads into environments already cut apart by fire. The alternatives, though, risked total collapse. Personal notes from senior officers reflect an unbearable tension, balancing between sacrificing more men or watching entire units overrun. The pressure was acute, described later as the weight of responsibility with no acceptable outcomes. Casualties grew steadily as the fight dragged on. Soldiers were pulled back with wounds ranging from shrapnel cuts to devastating trauma. While early reports released to media framed the clash as brief and contained. Later testimony painted a far more severe picture. Medics recalled treating line after line of injured men in improvised stations. Veterans and later assessments also noted that Taliban losses were likely higher than suggested in immediate NATO releases, though estimates varied widely. The uncertainty made clear just how chaotic the numbers remained, and that neither side's exact toll was ever fully embedded into official reports. The airwaves from that day remain among the starkest evidence of the pressure faced by those in the field. Radio traffic documented repeated pleas from frontline commanders, their voices alternating between urgent, strained, and resolutely calm, even as rounds struck nearby. Phrases like urgent and fire support now punctuated every channel. Junior leaders tried to maintain discipline, encouraging men to hold despite dwindling ammunition. Those calls, later reviewed in declassified excerpts, show not only tactical communication, but raw human endurance at the point of collapse. A decisive change came unexpectedly. A US B-1 bomber scrambled to the area, roared over the battlefield at low altitude without releasing a payload. Its presence alone altered momentum. For Canadians on the ground, the pass was both relief and signal, a confirmation that higher command recognized their plight. For Taliban fighters, it was evidence that the balance could tilt at any moment under air power. That psychological shock slowed the pace of fire long enough for units to reorganize, tend to the wounded, and restore some stability to the front. Veterans would later credit that single show of force with preventing total breakdown. The ambush at the White School revealed more than just an effective defensive stand. It exposed the dangers of advancing without reliable Allied support, as local police departures left coalition soldiers in isolation. It highlighted the cost of restrictive targeting policies that prevented immediate suppression of enemy positions in favor of restraint. And it underscored how well-prepared Taliban fighters could seize initiative when coalition assumptions underestimated their organization and discipline. Whether this confrontation was a deliberately orchestrated trap or whether NATO stumbled into the depth of local resistance remains debated. What is certain is that the engagement nearly compromised Operation Medusa before it properly began. In one clash, the coalition was forced to confront shortcomings in planning, the limits of partner forces, and the consequences of fighting under political constraint. Survivors carried away more than physical wounds. They carried an awareness that future operations would demand adaptation. The White School had tested NATO's resolve in its first major assault in Panjwai and made clear that further offensives could not be undertaken with the same assumptions. The coalition now faced a critical question: how to regroup after what had come close to disaster. NATO's learning curve, Operation Medusa, begins. Operation Medusa's opening blows were not defined solely by chaos at the White School. At higher levels of command, the battle was reframed as a test of NATO's ability to adapt. What followed was the coalition's attempt to convert a near loss into a coordinated offensive, one built on scale, timing, and firepower. The first priority was reorganization. NATO leaders reviewed how companies had been split across vulnerable terrain, how artillery and air support requests had stalled, and how local partner units had retreated under heavy pressure. The conclusion was stark. Piecemeal advances could not continue. Forward units would now attack in unison, with armor, artillery, and close air support integrated from the start. Canadian commanders retained the ground lead, but this time their troops would be backed by large-scale NATO fire support on a synchronized timeline. Massed force was deemed the only realistic way to disrupt entrenched Taliban bases in Panjwai. The decision carried symbolic weight as well as tactical logic. Kandahar was the heart of the insurgency, and Panjwai lay directly on its approaches. Yielding the district would suggest NATO lacked the will to protect its anchor province. To soldiers on the ground, the choice to fight was not just about farmland, but about credibility. The area represented where the coalition's strength amounted to more than rhetoric. The plan that emerged in late summer 2006 reflected this perspective. Commanders drew up a hammer and anvil strategy. NATO forces would apply pressure from the north, while Canadian units drove upward from the south, compressing Taliban fighters into a shrinking pocket. The intent was to prevent dispersion, which had so often spared insurgent formations from decisive defeat. At the same time, planners recognized Panjwai's defenses could not be dislodged by infantry alone. Operation Medusa became one of NATO's largest ground campaigns to date, combining Canadian armor and infantry with multinational artillery batteries, strike aircraft, and surveillance assets. The shift from small unit patrols to a multi-division assault underscored the stakes. The reorganization on paper was clear. Within units, however, perspective was shaped by memory.